You don't need to bring the textbooks in class. It may help at times, but it's not a mandatory thing. It may help with maps and things I'm referring to, but it's not mandatory. The textbook is designed to fill in the things that we're not talking about in class. There are certain things in the textbooks that you will be tested on in the exams. But you will, there we go, look at that. But you are in the textbook every time. But there is stuff that I will be dealing with in the texts. I mean, excuse me, in classes that's not in the textbooks. So you need to have both. The class is not going to follow the textbook by sort of absolute sort of rigidly follow it along. There's things I'm going to cover that are not in the textbook. There's things in the textbook that are fairly basic that I don't want to spend a lot of time covering, like things like Columbus. So that's sort of, I think, preview of where we're going. Oh, good. We've got an absolutely terrible image as well. Fantastic. Okay. This projector it looks so nice on my own. I don't know why it's... Oh, well. Well, I will give you, or I will hope that we can get through this. As I said, I'm going to try and change this room because I think it's doomed. All right. What I want to start to do today is I tend to divide this course into sections. And the first section is dealing with the world roughly about 1500 to 1750. And it's going to be dealing with a world in transition. A world that goes from being very much centered in and focused on Asia to one which by 1750 is becoming a world in which certain European nation-states are beginning to, you might say, sort of exercise a lot of economic and political and military power. But if we start today with the world in 1500, what we're looking at is an Asian-centered world. That is, if you want to sort of break it down, in terms of economy, in terms of political development, in terms of military skill, in terms of technological innovation, Asia, and in particular the area around the Indian Ocean. Again, I don't know why this map has come out this way. Let me see if I have a better map. See if this shows up any better. All right. No. We'll be coming back. All right. Indian Ocean, just so we all know what the Indian Ocean is. The area around the Indian Ocean is, in and about 1500, a place in many ways much more sophisticated, much more, to use a sort of loaded word, developed than Europe. Europe's still recovering from the plague, the Black Death. Europe is about to be plunged into the Reformation and a century of wars of religion. In Asia, as we'll talk about next week as well, you're going to have the rise at this period of fairly stable and coherent administrations and state institutions in places like China and India. What I want to talk about today is the economic power that exists in Asia and the way in which that economic power allows this region to basically drive what you might think of as the global economy of 1500. And also how the economic activity in this region impacts or affects technological and cultural development in this region and elsewhere too. So that's where I'm going today. I want to talk about sort of why this is an Asian-centered world in 1500 and what in particular Asia and this Indian Ocean region in particular has that sort of, lies behind this reality, lies behind the fact of sort of, Asia's importance. Just a couple of things about Asia, just to keep in mind. Before the year 1800, over 50% of all manufactured goods, that doesn't mean made in a factory, it simply means things made, manufactured goods, pottery, cloth that's woven, ships, anything manufactured. Over half of the manufactured goods in the entire world came from either India or China. They were the two dominant producers of manufactured goods. Not only for goods that were consumed domestically, but goods that were exported. Cloth, as I said, pottery, porcelain, cutlery, all sorts of things like that. So this is a place which, in 1500, is already very productive. It's a place that has a lot of resources in terms, and we'll talk about some of these, but it also has a lot of food. It has an ability to feed itself. It has an ability to produce. It has an increasing population, which increases its labor force. And there are people, and there are groups, and there are regions in this Indian Ocean or Asian world that are preparing, or that have been preparing by 1500 and will continue to do after 1500, things that will enable further expansion of state power, or of economic power, or of technological improvement. I saw a hand. Is there a question? Question? Yes. Yeah, before 1800, 50%. Or before 1800, over half of everything that's manufactured in the world comes from either India or China. Now we're talking about an Indian Ocean that sits really at the center of what I'm calling the global trade network of 1500. One caveat to that, or one sort of qualifier. The global trade network of 1500, the global, what we think of as sort of a global circuit that exists in 1500, does not include the Americas. Or it barely includes the Americas. Only in the late 1400s have Europeans begun to connect, and even then, not really by trade, simply at this point by conquest and sort of voyages of exploration. You don't have the Americas linked into this. There are trade networks within the Americas, especially in South and Central America. The Aztec Empire in Central America and Mexico, the Incan Empire in South America. Both have developed extensive trade networks, not necessarily with each other, but throughout their own sort of dominated regions. They're not linked to this larger trade network. But to give you an idea of the extent of this sort of global trade network, the Indian Ocean is sort of the focal point. Because the Indian Ocean contains the goods that most people in this network want. The Indian Ocean is wealthy because it has things that people want. And in particular, what the Indian Ocean has is spices. This is from a market in Goa in Western India. It's, again, part of the sort of Western Indian, coastal Indonesian economy to produce spices. You don't need a lot of rainfall. You don't need a lot of arable land to grow things like pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, etc. And these spices are not just sort of enormously prized by people in the region and outside it, but a spice is, and continues to be to this day, if you've ever seen the price on saffron, for example, a spice continues to be an enormously valuable commodity. That is, you have a small amount of spice worth an enormous amount at this point in gold or goods or trade. One account talking about medieval Germany says that if you wanted to get a half pound of nutmeg, you had to be willing to pay the price of 7 fat oxen. Not 7 ordinary sized oxen, 7 fat oxen. If the price was only 6.5 oxen, I don't know how you got change, but they gave you a calf or something. But it is something that is enormously priced. It's one estimate. is that in the 1400s, 1,000 tons of pepper alone went in to Europe every year. It was worth, every year, that 1,000 or so tons of pepper was worth, not just, I don't know how many oxen that would be, but it was basically equivalent to grain that would feed 1.25 million people that year. So 1,000 tons of pepper equals however many hundreds, perhaps thousands of tons that would be needed of grain to feed 1.25 million people for 1 year. And spices are valuable because they're not just sort of a luxury, they're a necessity at times. If you live in Europe, if you live in North Africa, if you even living in the Indian Ocean, less so in the Indian Ocean because so many people there are vegetarian, but in other parts of the world where people depend on beef and lamb, in particular, as foodstuffs, you have to have a way to preserve it. You have to have a way to make it taste good. You can't just say, oh, this looks like it's a little off, it doesn't smell right, I'm going to throw it out. No, you say what this needs is more pepper. So for preservation of food, for making food palatable, for ways of displaying your status by having access to sort of exotic spices or porcelain from China or eventually tea and things like that from India and China, you want to, or you need to do business with the Indian Ocean world. They have these goods that the rest of the world wants. And the rest of the world has figured out how to get them. That is what is the network I'm talking about. You have really sort of 3 networks. The Indian Ocean trade world, where all of these goods move around, are transported from China to India, to the east coast of Africa, and onward. But you have 2 networks that you might say sort of link in. The first is this. This is the medieval and sort of, around 1400, 1500 Mediterranean economy. It's a trade economy which had existed for centuries at this point. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, they had all traded in and around the Mediterranean. Arab traders from North Africa had used these trade routes. By the early 1400s, this Mediterranean trade route is dominated by cities at either end. On the western end, it's 2 Italian cities, Genoa and Venice. Genoa and Venice. It's these 2 cities which, by the late 1300s, early 1400s, are making an enormous amount. Genoa, G-E-N-O-A, Venice, V-E-N-I-C-E. They're making significant profits because they import all of this stuff. If you want to know why something called the Renaissance, among other things, happens in northern Italy, why people in northern Italy have a lot of money to throw at people like Michelangelo, say, you know what we're missing? We're missing an enormous statue of David. No, he doesn't need clothes. That's fine. It's because there's so much money in northern Italy from trade. Florence is not a seaport. I've never been to Florence in Italy. Florence is not a seaport, but Florence is where the bankers were. They financed the trade. Venice and Genoa is where the merchants and the shipbuilders were. Columbus himself from Genoa. A lot of those sort of early explorers, Amerigo Vespucci, others like that, in the Atlantic world, all coming from this northern Italian tradition. So they make an enormous amount of money by then moving goods out of the Mediterranean into northern and western Europe. They also bring goods out of there, but they don't sell them very much outside of the Mediterranean. No one in the Indian Ocean wants wool from the Netherlands. Very few people want beer from Germany. There's not a huge call for timber, these goods that northern and western Europe produces. And we'll talk about one ramification of that in a little bit. So if you have Venice and Genoa on one side, on the other side, you have 2 cities, one which is fading in importance for this trade by 1500, but another which is still pretty active. The one that's fading is up here. It's Constantinople. Now, of course, Istanbul. Constantinople was the traditional place where the Silk Road started. Marco Polo, etc., into Asia. It was a place in which trade that reached the Black Sea, coming down even from what's now Russia, made its way into the Mediterranean. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquers Constantinople. And a lot of European traders don't want to trade with the Ottoman Empire. So they begin to rely more heavily on the other port city. That's sort of this, almost sort of a network hub, you might say. And that's Cairo, down here in Egypt. Cairo is sort of the gateway into the Red Sea and then into the Indian Ocean. And all of these cities, especially Cairo, have, you might say, sort of extremely diverse populations. People who travel there, people who set up there because they are middlemen. They're merchants. They're sailors looking for work. They're brokers looking to buy and sell goods. You have in places like Cairo these very sort of cosmopolitan cities. Multiple languages, multiple religious faiths. People using Cairo as sort of either a final destination or a stopping off point on their way into the Indian Ocean. So this is one trade network, which through Venice and Genoa on one side, and basically by 1500 Cairo on the other side, is linked into this larger Asian world. There's another important trade network that we need to think about. This is the only one that doesn't have to do with an ocean or with seaborne trade. This is the West African or Trans-Saharan trade network, which also exists in the 13 and 1400s. In the 13 and 1400s, you see the rise of powerful kingdoms, powerful empires in West Africa. In particular, the empire called Mali, M-A-L-I, Mali. These are empires which are based on the production of a couple of very valuable resources. Anyone know what comes out of West Africa? Gold and...
Ivory.
Sorry?
Ivory?
Not ivory. Nope, that's going to be later.
Diamonds.
Not diamonds.
Oil.
Nope, it's something, it's every day. You all have it in your house.
Salt.
Salt. Salt. Again, we talk about preserving stuff. Salt. The salt fields and the gold fields of West Africa are enormously valuable. And you have the rise of kingdoms. First the one called Ghana, then the one called Mali. And these empires control access to these fields. They bring in slave labor. They capture slaves in wars to work in these gold fields and in these salt fields. And they use an existing caravan system, camel-based, sort of the ships of the desert, as somebody once called them, to take the salt and the gold to Cairo, the Mediterranean, and even eventually through the Red Sea down to other port cities like Mombasa in what's now Kenya in East Africa. This is important because the salt, of course, is a very valuable commodity that flows out into the Mediterranean in particular. The gold is hugely important because gold coming out of West Africa is the single most, you might say, or West Africa, I should say, is the single most important supplier of gold to this economy. And Europeans, people in North Africa, people in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, they need that gold to buy goods in Asia. They need gold, they need silver, they need currency, because they don't have goods to trade. As I said, nobody wants to buy wool in Sumatra. There is not a huge demand for, sort of wine from northern France in parts of southern India. So instead, you've got to pay cash, or you've got to work out some sort of system of credit, some sort of system of trade balances, or of eventual payment that will allow trade to continue. Over the course of the period from about 1300 to 1500, even into the 1600s, you see a dramatic flow of gold and silver out of the Mediterranean world, out of Europe, out of West Africa, and into this Asian world. Through the mid-1500s, the rest of the world is going to be pretty cash poor. That changes dramatically, we'll be talking about this fairly soon, when the Spanish conquer and take control of silver mines in South America, in places like Bolivia. Because the Spanish will ultimately flood the globe with silver, leading, in fact, to inflation. Again, an indication of sort of how global this economy is. By the early 1600s, Chinese villagers, Chinese artisans will find that they cannot keep up with rising food prices. Food prices they cannot keep up with food prices because of inflation. Inflation because of the amount of silver that's now in circulation. So you have, again, an economy that is already very well connected. The Americas are basically going to get plugged into this global economy. They're not going to take it over, they're going to become part of it. So you have, again, two important networks. The Mediterranean network, the West African Trans-Saharan network, feeding into the Indian Ocean network. And in West Africa, for example, in a place like Mali, historians, archaeologists, and others, they've found pieces of Chinese pottery. They've seen evidence of not just sort of consumption, but cultural transmission. As West Africa begins to export gold and silver and attracts more trade from North Africa into this region, ultimately this part of the world becomes more Islamic. That is, Ghana, and in particular Mali, are overtly, publicly Islamic states, Islamic empires. They build mosques, they build libraries. Even today, this part of West Africa has a huge Muslim population, which is a result of the trade, the trans-Saharan trade, that linked the goods and the people here with the people and their culture here. So it's not just goods moving, it's not just money moving, it's also culture that moves with people. People carry tangible things, they also carry with them, you might say, sort of intangible things. Cultural preferences, languages, religious beliefs. Okay, let's get to the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean, as I said, is an enormously wealthy place. A lot of resources, lots of things that the rest of the world wants. And people in the Indian Ocean and the Asian economy, they recognize the popularity of these goods. This is not something new in 1500. But by 1500, you have reached almost sort of the peak of the economic and technological innovation that has allowed this economy to become so profitable. That has allowed this economy to make so many people so much wealth. It's not simply that the Indian Ocean, that China, have goods that the rest of the world, or the rest of this trade network, wants. It's that they have taken steps to ensure that they can get those goods to the rest of the world. That is, it's not just sort of the development of systems of credit. I think I'll come back and talk about these in a little bit. Systems of communication. It's also significant technological changes that are made that allow, by 1500, this economy to have such reach and such scope. The first thing about this economy is that I think we ought to divide it into two halves. The western half is this side of the Indian Ocean here, the western half of the Indian Ocean, including Arabia and the East African coast, all of which had important trade cities. Trade tended to talk sort of point to point. That is, if you were the recipient in, say, Genoa, let's go even further north, say you're the recipient in Paris of black pepper, that black pepper has passed through, and some historians estimate, about 9 different trades, 9 different sets of hands to reach you. That is, you might have got it in Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. It might have gone to a port in Arabia or East Africa, then it went to Cairo, then it went perhaps to another port in North Africa, maybe it went to Sicily, then it went to Genoa. Then it comes to you. multiple transactions to get the good. It's not you buy it one place and you bring it home yourself. Instead, it is multiple stages. It's one of the reasons why these goods cost so much in Europe. That is, it's 1,000%, if not more, markup by the time you pay for a good in Europe. Because, of course, everyone has traded it on, everyone has made a little bit as their part of the trade. So we have the western side, the Indian Ocean, India, east coast of Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. I want to talk about that first. Because there, you have something that specifically drives technological innovation. You've got a lot of goods that people want to move around, but you also have a very significant weather system. You have a very significant environmental challenge in this part of the world. This part of the Indian Ocean is dominated by what are called monsoons. A monsoon system is one basically where the wind, the prevailing winds, the weather moves on in a certain predictable way. In particular, in the western part of the Indian Ocean, you roughly have the year divided into two. The wind blows to the southwest half the year, the wind blows to the northeast half the year. The monsoon is critical, not just for sailing, not just for shipping, but the monsoon, especially for southern India, is critical because the monsoon winds bring the storms that bring rain. Southern India does not have access to a lot of water the way northern India does. Northern India has all the snow melt from the Himalayas. That's why northern India has, to this day, enormously successful agriculture. Southern India, not a lot of sort of, you might say, indigenous water supply. Hugely dependent on the monsoons to bring rain, which will allow people to stock up and to save water. Cities, villages on the coast and inland in southern India, even if you visit places today, you will see enormous systems called tanks, which are basically these huge man-made rivers or reservoirs, which were designed to capture what the monsoon produced. If the monsoon came late, the monsoon ended early, that could be really catastrophic. And if you've ever been in a monsoon season, it's not just simply that it's going to rain once a day. It's going to rain every day for significant length with significant intensity over a period of months. Yeah.
You said South India is the one that's needing water?
Yeah, South India needs water. Southern India needs water. Northern India has access to a huge amount of water because of access to the Himalayas. So you have a monsoon system. This monsoon system is very powerful. It is very hard, if you're not familiar with it, to sail in the monsoon system. In essence, the winds say basically you can only sail from, say, Mombasa here in Kenya to the western coast of India. You can only do that for 6 months out of the year. Because the other 6 months you're going to be sailing directly into the wind. When the Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama fetches up, he actually comes to Mombasa in 1497 as part of his sort of out and back journey to India. He gets to Mombasa, and people there tell him, look, this is the system. You've got to figure out, you've got to either prepare, you've got to prepare to sort of stay here for a while, go at the end of the monsoon season to India, and then catch the switch to be able to sail back, or you're going to go now, and you're going to have to stay in India and wait. Da Gama famously doesn't listen, and there's a famous Arab navigator. This is the story. He actually existed. Whether he actually met Da Gama at this point is still not quite known. But his name is Ibn Majid, I-B-N, and then M-A-J-I-D. I'll come back to him, but Ibn Majid becomes famous because in the 1490s he's going to publish the first sort of book about how you navigate the Indian Ocean. I'll just give you the name now. Sorry. It's about 1495, and the name of the book is the Fawa, F-A-W-A, apostrophe Eid, I-D. The Fava Eid, which means roughly the Book of Useful Knowledge. That's the short title. It has a very long title too, but everyone calls it the Fava Eid. The Book of Useful Knowledge. Because it was about, here are the monsoons. Here's when they blow here. Here's when they blow in the other direction. Da Gama didn't listen. Da Gama said, sure, fine, whatever monsoon wins. I've got this fancy ship called the Caravel. I'm going to go. So he went and made it really quickly. I think it was less than 2 weeks he made it from Mombasa to the western coast of India. Then he tried to come back. It took over 3 months, and most of his crew died. And he got back, and people said, well, do you believe us now? Da Gama's remarks are not written down for posterity. But this was the strength of the monsoon system. Now, in order to trade and to keep trading in this sort of system, you couldn't simply say, well, I'm going to go one place, wait 6 months, and go home. You had to figure out a way to move. What existed when Da Gama was there, and something that's going to get incorporated into later Portuguese vessels, that's going to get incorporated into vessels designed by other European sailors, is a sort of sail which Arab and Indian sailors had used for hundreds of years. Again, the need to trade and the need to overcome these environmental obstacles prompts technological innovation. And it's fairly simple. It's actually something you may have seen. That is, it's called a lateen sail. It's a triangular sail. This is a kind of a boat that's found in northwestern India and the East African coast called a dhow, D-H-O-W, a dhow, which is very sort of shallow. It's wide, but it's shallow. It can sail. It doesn't need a lot of it doesn't have a lot of draft. That is, it doesn't need a lot of water underneath it to sail. What you do basically is you have this triangular sail attached to a boom, a mast here, and a boom here, this movable piece here, and you tie the sail off at various places on the rail. And what it does is it allows you to sail even when you don't have the wind directly at your back. You still can't sail directly head-on into the wind, of course. But you can sail where, or at least in the approximate direction you'd like to go by harnessing the wind. That is, if the wind is blowing in this direction and you want to go this direction, you rig your lateen sail like this. The force of the wind hits the sail, it's going to drive the vessel, and then you use the rudder. For many dhows, it was actually, this is a recent picture, but dhows previously had these sort of long oars, or sweep arms, as they were sometimes called, off the back, off the stern. They allowed you to sort of move. So basically, what the lateen sail does is it allows you to take the power of the wind and use that without being necessarily blown in the direction the wind is going. This is now sort of a standard piece of sailing equipment, sometimes called a jib sail, if you've ever sailed or seen a sailboat or something like that. A triangular sail that can be adjusted that allows you to catch the wind, even if the wind is not blowing the exact direction you wish to go. This is the big innovation in the western part of the Indian Ocean. It's something that will eventually make its way into other vessels, Chinese vessels, European vessels in particular. But here, you see people, and what this allowed you to do was even if you couldn't go point to point, Mombasa to western India, you could go coastally. You could use the winds. If the wind was blowing directly against you, you couldn't go that way, but you could go coastally. You could trade between East Africa and Arabia. You could trade between the west coast of India and Arabia. That's how they made the system work. Again, the promise of profit in the Indian Ocean inspires an enormous amount of technological innovation. Now let's turn to the other side of the Indian Ocean, to the east of India, into what's now Malaysia, Indonesia, and China. And here it's the Chinese who are the innovators. Because the Chinese have a very particular, you might say, environmental or geographic challenge themselves. That is, they've got to get through the South China Sea, through, the fancy term is the Indonesian archipelago. Archipelago means lots of islands. Don't worry about that word. Indonesia, though, is made up of, I think it's actually hundreds of little islands. Some major, some very small. Then, as now, it is very difficult to sail or to travel through these islands. There are all sorts of unmarked or uncharted obstacles, especially, of course, 600 years ago. Piracy, then and now, is very big in this part of the world. A lot of piracy takes place in here because it's very easy to hide. If you know the local waters, you know the layout, and the person whose ship you're hijacking or taking over does not. And this extends not only into Indonesia, but even into parts of southern China. That you might think it's very hard to make a massive container ship disappear. In fact, it's compared to what you think it might be, it's relatively easy for people to take a ship, deposit the crew somewhere, put the ship in, refit the ship, repaint it, reflag it, as it's called. Basically, if it was registered in Panama, you re-register it in someplace like Liberia. Give it a new name, a new flag, new coat of paint, out you go. And it's a very profitable business. Now, it's not very profitable if you get caught. But because of the environmental advantages, local advantages here, piracy has thrived here for centuries. So the Chinese have a challenge. If they want to move goods, like, for example, silk, porcelain, spices, tea, if they want to move these goods out of southern China and into the Indian Ocean and further on, they've got to figure out how to sail safely, but also swiftly through this region here. And it's the Chinese who put together, you might say, almost sort of the complete package. They will borrow sail designs from the Indian Ocean, but they bring in certain other things that I think are, that fundamentally remake sailing between about, the 900s and the 1400s. There are three elements that the Chinese introduce. The first is this. Oops, sorry. The first. Sorry, I wasn't sure of my order there. The first is this. This might, I think they're all very important, so I don't want to rank them in importance. First is the rudder. A specific type of rudder called an axial rudder. A-X-I-A-L. The axial rudder. That is, the rudder is attached to what's called the center line of the ship's hull. As if you were to split the ship in half, center line right there, you put the rudder there. Traditionally, as I talked about with those dhows, as we talked about, if you talk, for example, about Roman ships or Greek ships in the Mediterranean, traditionally you had a rudder, but it was nothing more than a large oar off of the stern of the ship. And having this sort of rudder system made steering very slow. You could not adjust as quickly. If you saw something, if you needed to change course because of a weather system, a natural obstacle, anything like that, it took several people pushing. You can imagine when you have a sweep arm where the actual oar itself is about as wide as this table, if not longer. And you've got to push that through water. That's very hard to do. You can't do it quickly. You can't change direction quickly. If you put the rudder here, actually attach it to the ship's axis, to the ship's hull, you can then use what's called a windlass. As you can see here, basically you have a system of pulleys that allow you to change the direction, or to change the sort of the attitude, change the angle of the rudder. Only takes one or two people to do it. It can be done much more quickly. It means that you can turn, move, maneuver at greater speed. So you can maintain the greater speed and still avoid obstacles. Again, this is about the safety of the ship and the safety of the cargo. The ship's owners and those who have their sort of fortunes resting on the sale of these cargoes, they have a huge incentive in sponsoring this. So by about 800 CE, the Chinese are beginning to take the rudders from being oars, or beginning to change from having sort of oars as rudders to actually attaching them to the ships. There's something else they do around the same time, which is they begin to build ships that contain Bulkheads. Anybody know what a bulkhead is? No one? It's what failed in the Titanic. Bulkheads are watertight compartments, or at least are supposed to be watertight compartments. They are designed to allow a ship to survive something that might otherwise be catastrophic. That is, bulkhead design allows you to minimize and basically sort of localize damage. You run aground, somebody rams you, something like that, part of the hull caves in, this part will fill with water, but if it's done correctly and sealed correctly, it's not going to flood the rest of the vessel. That is, it's a way of compartmentalizing the disaster or the damage. What happened in the Titanic was that the seals at the top of the bulkheads failed. And so the water went up after the top of the bulkhead and went to the next one, at which point the bulkhead system no longer is effective. So it's a way of ensuring that your ship can get, perhaps, or has a better likelihood of reaching its destination, and that your goods, the goods that are in that bulkhead, you're going to have to write those off. That's why people come up with things called insurance. But, by and large, if you have an accident, something happens, you can still salvage the ship, and you can probably salvage most of the cargo. So again, this is about making ships move more quickly and more safely. The rudder allows you to move more quickly. The bulkhead ensures that even if the rudder can't help you, you will be able to at least preserve the value of most of the stuff on the ship. So these are very important. To give you an idea, Europeans don't start building ships with bulkheads until around the 1700s. That is, even the Europeans involved in the Atlantic trades, they are not going to start building bulkheads. In fact, I think if I remember correctly, the historian who's traced this says not even until about 1790 that bulkheads become a sort of standard feature on European cargo vessels.
So what year did you say the Chinese developed this?
The Chinese developed, well, there's a little bit of dispute, but it's definitely between about 400 and 700 the Chinese developed bulkheads. And it's around the 700s to 800s that they developed the rudder. The final thing that the Chinese developed, and here it's in the early 11th century, so the early 1000s, is the magnetic compass. The magnetic compass means that navigation becomes much easier. The magnetic compass means that you no longer have to rely on two traditional systems of navigating. One was called dead reckoning. Does anyone know what dead reckoning is? It's basically where you have to stay within sight of land. And you have to use specific points to navigate. Basically, aim towards that. Don't get too close to that. The water is shallow the closer you get to this particular sort of point or reef or something like that. The other one is celestial navigation. That is by the stars. More problematic if it's raining and it's cloudy. Also problematic during daytime. So celestial navigation was, sort of more reliable when you're out in the open ocean. But it's only the invention of the magnetic compass that means you can have, basically, all weather, all conditions navigation. You don't have to have different reference points. North is always north, as long as your compass works. North is always north. And it means a couple of things. It means now that you can have confidence in a course you set. So you can now sail faster, travel faster, get these goods moved faster. The other thing that it means is that you can now really standardize sailing. You can now draw up reliable charts and almanacs, reliable maps that lay out the safest, the quickest routes at particular times of year in particular conditions between certain parts of the Indian Ocean. That's what Ibn Majid is doing in this Fawaid. It's not only telling you when the monsoons are blowing, It's describing the depths of certain harbors, how to approach certain harbors. Sometimes it gives dead reckoning. Sometimes, in later editions, it uses compass directions. But it now standardizes it so that if you have an almanac, you have a map or a chart that says you are going you go north for a certain amount of time. You use the compass to tell you, where southwest is. It means that ships get even faster. Within 200 years or so, you'll have the inventions, of things like longitude that will help you plot your point in the ocean with even greater specificity. But having a magnetic compass means you can now start standardizing routes. And that you can rely on something that's you're not dependent on either sort of landmarks or on celestial navigation. So you might say sort of the economic promise of the Indian Ocean spurs a great deal of technological innovation. All of which by the late 1400s is allowing for the rapid movement of goods out of this area into other parts of the world. By the late 1400s, this rapid movement of goods is matched by the rapid movement of ideas and technology. By the early 1400s, the Portuguese in particular, we'll talk about them more in a couple of weeks, but the Portuguese in particular are beginning to gather up as much information about shipbuilding and about navigation as they can. A lot of which is coming out of the Indian Ocean and the Asian world. Any questions about this part? This is sort of the way in which you see economics driving, you might say, sort of technological development. Any questions about this? Okay. I don't want to go too fast. So we do have a lot to cover, but I want to make sure that we're not, leaving people behind. And as I mentioned here, if you didn't get a chance to write down, Ibn Majid, the Fawaid, in the 1490s. I put up here it's circa 1100. There's some dispute. Some people say the exact first magnetic compass comes in 1050, but I'm going to say basically sometime in the late 11th century. Okay, let me talk a little bit about economics and, you might say, culture, social life, political life in the Indian Ocean world. The promise of profit not only drives technological innovation, but the promise of profit creates a very sort of specific culture. One that you might say unites the various sort of port cities around the Indian Ocean. One interesting thing is that the cities on the Indian Ocean, cities like Mombasa in Kenya, places like Goa in Western India, these are places that sort of exist almost as sort of independent city-states. They may occupy land that is technically under the control of a larger empire, but by and large they're self-governing. Empires in East Africa, empires in South and East Asia, in this time period, from about 1300 on, these are empires that are largely concerned with the control of land. That is, you make your money by taxing the land. In essence, the emperor owns the land and everyone else pays rent. These empires were happy to have these trading cities as part of their empires, but they didn't look at trade as their sort of lifeblood. They said this empire rises and falls by its control of land. Trade was sort of hard to put a hard and fast figure on. You knew how much land you had. Calculating a volume of trade or something is much more difficult. So you have these fairly independent city-states. They would tend to pay tribute to empires and emperors, but they were fairly removed from direct control by these empires. And in fact, they began they began to look less like these sort of empires in southern India, even in coastal China, than they did like each other. That is, you had the creation of these sort of port communities, port cities, linked by trade, that tended to have much more in common with each other than they did perhaps with a settlement 300 or 400 miles inland. That is, they might share a geographical location, but their outlook, their orientation was very different. And I think that trade and the promise of profit is absolutely fundamental in understanding why these cities developed as they did. In the first place, these cities attract lots of people from around the Indian Ocean and even from elsewhere. In East Africa, in southern India, in Indonesia, you have settlements of traders, especially traders from North Africa, traders from Arabia, who will move throughout not only simply to gather goods, but ultimately to sort of stay and become brokers, become, sort of warehousers, people who serve as sort of, middlemen for other traders arriving and the people growing spices, producing cotton textiles, things like that. If you go to a place like, there's a city in southern India called Cochin, Cochin. If you go there, you can see one of the few remaining synagogues left in India. There's hardly a congregation left. But up until the 1940s and 1950s, there was a fairly sizable population of Jewish residents in and around Cochin, who were the descendants of earlier North African Jews who had traded and had settled throughout the Indian Ocean. They had significant links back to Cairo. One of the things that has been a focus of a lot of historical work in the last 20 or 30 years has been this huge collection of documents that was found in Cairo. I can't remember when exactly it was found. It hasn't been too long ago that it was found. But it's basically this huge genealogical record of Jewish people living throughout North Africa, especially in and around Cairo in the Middle Ages, and records of their travels back and forth, especially into the Indian Ocean. And you have settlements like Cochin, which have not only a synagogue, but Cochin will, and to this day, continues to have a significant population, not just of Hindus, there's Buddhists, there are Muslims, there are varieties of Christians. You have some Roman Catholic Christians. That's largely the result of the Portuguese coming into India in the 1500s. But you also have people who are known as Syrian Christians. People who say that their community was founded by St. Thomas in the 1st century. Thomas the Apostle journeyed from Syria all the way across the Indian Ocean to southern India. So you have multiple religious communities. And the thing is, in these communities, you don't have a lot of religious strife. You don't have a lot. At a time in the early 1500s, when Europeans are setting off to start burning each other and sacking towns and villages and driving people out of their homes because of what they believe or don't believe, in these network sort of cities, in these Indian Ocean communities, you have a great deal of diversity and a great deal of, you might say, religious freedom. And I don't think it's necessarily because people there are absolutely, if you ask them, what about your ideological commitment to religious liberty, they might look at you kind of strange. But they might say, it's not good to antagonize the people you trade with. It is not good to make enemies when you want to make money. You've heard the phrase, politics makes strange bedfellows, strange coalitions, strange partnerships. And that's nothing compared to what the promise of money will do. The history of humankind is in many ways, not entirely, but is in many ways the history of what human beings will do to get rich. In a place like Cochin, it was much more important to get along so that you could make money. Establishing the sort of dominance of your religion or the superiority of your religion, that was not important. Now it helps, of course, that in Cochin you have a large Hindu population. Hinduism does not, especially southern Indian Hinduism, to this day, is a very open and welcoming faith. It does not say that there is only one way to God. It basically says there's always ways to go. And so it's fairly easy for other religions to not just sort of coexist, but to sort of intermingle in regions like this. So you have people there from different communities. You have in Kuchen, I don't have a picture, I'm sorry, I thought I put this in the PowerPoint, but I don't. You have in Kuchen what people call the Chinese fishing nets. There are these sort of elaborate nets set up in sort of the coast. Kuchen is on the coast, and there's rivers that feed into it, and these sort of marshy areas, sort of low-lying bays. There are fishermen in the harbor in Kuchen who fish, not by sort of going out in a vessel, not by using lines, but they have these elaborate sort of net systems that they dip into the water. It's like almost on cranes, and then lift out. The local legend, the local story, is that these are nets that were brought by Chinese settlers to Kuchen. And well, you might say, well, this is only a local story. The only other place that archaeologists have ever found evidence of nets like this is in southern China, which is where those Chinese sailors and Chinese traders, by and large, came from in the late Middle Ages and the early modern. So you have evidence of not just sort of cultural transmission, but even, again, a different sort of technological transmission. There's another way, too. As I said, a lot of these traders are Arabic. Many of them are Muslim, but to be Arabic simply means you're from Arabia. It doesn't necessarily mean not all Arabs are Muslims, not all Muslims are Arabs. Something that often, I think, is lost in sort of public consciousness. But you have, with the spread of Arab trade, the larger and larger sort of settlement of Arab traders, their families, setting up communities, you will have some cultural changes. A lot of these Arabs are, in fact, Muslim. So you will have the spread of Islam. In fact, if you look at that Indian Ocean map, you're looking at the part of the world where the vast majority of the world's Muslims live. Again, something that I think is not necessarily on our radar, in our public consciousness. You know where the largest population of Muslims in the world is? It's in Asia, Indonesia. That is, I forget the exact order, but I know Indonesia is number one. But if you look at most populous or largest Muslim populations in the world, it's something like Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and then India. It's fairly close. In India, Muslims are only about 11% of the population, but that's 11% of over 1 billion. So there's always, as I said, not all Arabs are Muslim, not all Muslims are Arab. But you do see the spread of Islamic culture and practice. You also see the spread of Arabic language, most notably in the creation of a language that we now call Swahili, up here, Swahili, which literally means the coast, or the language spoken on the coast. Swahili is a language whose roots, whose sort of structure and base is in an East African language called Bantu, B-A-N-T-U, Bantu. But about 30 or 40% of all of the vocabulary, all of the words in Swahili come from Arabic. That is, there is a very different vocabulary in coastal East Africa than inland by the 1400s. And ultimately, this is recognized as its own sort of language group. And in fact, in places like Kenya, Swahili is now the majority spoken language. But it starts because, again, trading communities which emerge, places like Mombasa here in, Mombasa down here in southern Kenya, places like the island of Zanzibar, which became an enormously important and wealthy sort of trade port by itself, had its own sort of sultan, its own sort of government, well up into the 1700s, 1800s. So you have these places where language itself is being changed. And people who study Swahili also argue that there are, not a lot, but there are enough words there to at least be noticeable that come from Tamil, which is a southern Indian language. Most of the Indian sailors employed in the Indian Ocean trade, that is employed as basically sort of deckhands, cheap labor on board these vessels, came from the part of India that's now known as Tamil Nadu and spoke Tamil. Southern India, southern coast of India. And people who study Swahili say, look, there's enough words, a few dozen perhaps, but there's enough words in Swahili that can't be traced either to Bantu or to Arabic, but do seem to be related to this Indian language. So you have cultural transmission, religious practices, you have linguistic unity, all of which is ultimately very helpful for trade. People pick up enough Arabic that even if they themselves don't speak it, they're able to trade. It becomes this sort of, what's called in one sense, a lingua franca, a common language, where people will pick up enough. It's the language of trade. It's why in the Mediterranean world, even when the Romans ruled, everyone involved in trade spoke Greek. Because that's what you did in the port cities. It was a result of Alexander the Great and the expansion of Greece, even before the Roman Empire, several hundred years before the Roman Empire. That this sort of shorthand, basically sort of, conversational Greek emerged. And it's a way in which people could trade, even when they didn't speak each other's native language. You could rely on this. It's why, when the first sort of editions or first sort of texts that will become the New Testament move out of Palestine into other parts of the Mediterranean world, they're written in Greek. They're not written in Latin. They're not, despite what you may have seen in various places, they're not written in English. I can't stress that. They are not written, sometimes they're written in Aramaic. But the first translation is into the Greek because it's assumed that people living in the coastal world, people living in the trading world of the Mediterranean will have some familiarity with Greek. Then other translations will happen. But the first translations are from Aramaic into Greek. Like this sort of everyday Greek, you have a sort of everyday Arabic. And the most, I think, sort of important example of the way in which Arabic comes into the language, or the way in which Arabic sort of permeates the Indian Ocean world, is to look at the development of Swahili. What we're going to talk about next time, we're going to start talking about China in this period, and we're going to talk about the Chinese having perhaps the one opportunity to sort of, if not unify, potentially control this very loosely affiliated trade network in the Indian Ocean. We're going to turn to that next time. We're going to talk about the Ming Empire in China, and then we'll talk about the Mughals in India. So we'll do that all next week. Email me with concerns if you can. If you're having trouble with books or things like that, please try to get everything as soon as you can. Thank you.
Okay, so the first quiz is on Monday on this, right?
Yeah, first map quiz is Monday.
I'm curious, is there not Portuguese in Swahili too?
There may be a little bit of Portuguese, yes. Not necessarily a lot.
Okay, I just heard that
Yeah.
Portuguese also.
Well, the Portuguese in East Africa certainly were there. Sorry, hold on. But the Portuguese were. The Portuguese came later. That is, Swahili develops after about the 900s, and the Portuguese are in East Africa in the 1500s. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I just am a bit curious about the quiz. Is it everything that's in bold is what we should know? Like,
Yeah, the countries.
Okay.
The countries. Yeah, but don't worry about all the Kyrgyzstans, Kazakhstans, places
So
like
what
that.
should I worry about though? Because I don't want to study the whole thing. And then
Well, as I said, sort of major places.
Okay.
Even if you just eliminate all of this sort of Central Asian there, then you'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, but focus mostly on Asia and the Southern Pacific here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Do you know where I could go to actually get help with my Blackboard login? Because I cannot get it at all.